Hello and good morning, everyone. I guess afternoon, huh? Thank you all for attending today's MS Research Symposium. Hope you guys had a great morning and a good keynote speaker and a good lunch. Well, my name's Erin Bickus. I'm the Team Engagement Manager with the National Multiple Sclerosis Society here in Chicago. And you guys have come to a great breakout session. We have our speaker here today is Dr. Matthew McCoyd. Dr. McCoyd is an assistant professor for the Department of Neurology at Loyola University Medical Center. He also serves as the Assistant Neurology Residency Program Director and Clerkship Director at the Stritch School of Medicine at Loyola. He completed a clinical neurophysiology fellowship at University of Chicago. A member of the Clinical Advisory Committee of the Greater Illinois Chapter, Dr. McCoyd directs the MS program at Loyola. So we're going to listen to his presentation. We're hoping at 2:15 about to give you guys opportunity for questions and answers. So myself and Crystal over there in the orange shirt we'll be walking around with microphones, so flag us down during that time period when we have Q&A. And so right now I'll hand it over to Dr. McCoyd and enjoy the presentation.
So thank you. Just for a quick sound check, can you guys hear me pretty clearly? All right, so I'm Matthew McCoyd. If you're wondering, there's another physician's name up there. That's Radha Bapsar. Radha's a physician who's been working with me and has helped me do some of the research for this presentation and a couple other presentations that we did. So I don't know if Radha made it out here yet, but I really want to thank her for a lot of her effort and pulling some articles and trying to help me put together some of the slides for this presentation. So Colleen Friedman from the National MS Society, I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to volunteer for the symposium. I got to go last year. Dr. Hauser's presentation was great. I was taking notes today as well. Asked me if I would talk about complementary and alternative therapies, which I thought would be an interesting topic for me personally to look at. I thought Dr. Hauser and I thought the keynote speaker today and Dr. Wynn in the breakout session really kind of spoke to this to some extent. So this is a statement by Charcot from about the 1860s. And Charcot, in the statement, Charcot is the neurologist who really first described multiple sclerosis, all the clinical features of it, incredibly well described pathologically. By about 1868, it's well done. I think what he said then about treatment of MS is probably true about some of the complementary and alternative therapies that are at least of interest in multiple sclerosis that we unfortunately just don't have a lot of data. And for those of you who are at the morning session, Dr. Wynn, I thought, spoke to this very eloquently about CCSVI. Very interesting idea. It's, I think, wonderful to think outside of the box, approach problems from a different way. But we really need the scientific data and evidence to show that things are worthwhile. So if we are going to stand here as a community of both healthcare providers, patients, families, and say, this is worth your time, your effort, your money, it's great to have that rigorous scientific data that's applied. Just listening to the presentation today about all of the things that have gone into stem cell remyelination, talking about 20 or 30 years of really painstaking science to get to a point where you can say, listen, we think this is safe, we think this is going to be effective, and we think it's worth trying. And unfortunately, for a lot of these complementary therapies, we simply don't have that data point yet. So we're a little bit limited in terms of what we can talk about when it comes to evidence-based medicine. So one of the things I thought I would focus on is a complementary and alternative treatment that has become very, very important here in the state of Illinois. This is far and away the question I am asked the most as a clinician. I can tell you, in all honesty, the typical story I have is it's at the end of one of my clinic visits, and I'm obviously a little bit of a younger physician compared to physicians older than myself. And so usually at the end of the session, the patient, a lot of times they're with a family member. I usually have a resident or a student with me because I work for an academic center, and it's been unusual. Patients don't usually ask to talk to me alone, and so I usually assume it's going to be about sexual dysfunction, which is common, and I understand people are bladder issues. I understand it. Overwhelmingly, this is the question I'm being asked. What is the information about medical marijuana in Illinois? Is there any data about it in multiple sclerosis? I can say this is one of the few times in my career when my friends have called me a lot. My Facebook page, right? My Facebook page has gotten popular. We went to high school together. I don't know if you remember me. Aren't you a doctor in Illinois? I was sitting at Starbucks, actually, the other night, putting this together. Starbucks has an internet connection. I was very popular at Starbucks. I didn't know why all the high school kids kept talking to me. I thought it was strange. So certainly a matter of interest. Medical marijuana has been around for a long time. So have a lot of things. The data on medical marijuana goes back literally a few thousand years. The first sort of available literature, per se, on medical marijuana goes back to around 2900 BC. It was used in Chinese culture. It was advocated for treatment of a variety of things. It was cited, this is supposedly a picture from a Roman textbook. It was cited by the Romans as a specific treatment for, again, a number of things. It really has been used in most cultures. It appears to have really spread across the world for use. And that's true of medical marijuana as it is true of a lot of different products. Right? We have tried a lot of different things throughout time looking for effective treatments for a variety of maladies, and this is just one of them as well. In the United States of America, this was one of the original cash crops. So when we settled Virginia, we were expected to develop a certain amount of crops to bring back to the English, in addition to tobacco and corn, etc. This was one product that was grown. The English were actually particularly interested in it for its rope. Right? It makes particularly strong rope. The English are a sailing country. You need rope for your ships. So there's a lot of interest in it. Don't know how true it is. Maybe the Declaration of Independence was written on hemp-based paper. It does not mean you can smoke it. Theoretically, if we sent it back to the English king and said, smoke this, it would have been maybe effective. It was commonly used in the 1800s and early 1900s. Now, that being said, just because it was used doesn't mean it was a great option. At one point in time, Abraham Lincoln was treated with mercury. Mercury is really bad for you. So just because people did it doesn't mean it was necessarily a great idea that we got away from. But there certainly was a fairly common medical use. It was advertised, pretty commonly accessible. There wasn't necessarily the FDA at that point in time, so the research studies were really, by today's standards, completely different. Its use really started to get restricted around 1906. That's when they started putting in stricter and stricter rules. You have Upton Sinclair's a book about the meat processing industry. That's kind of when we start developing the FDA. And we started regulating things like our food product and our medical product, which is probably a really great idea. So it really became essentially inaccessible from that time through the 60s, 70s. And you started to see the pendulum swing. First state to legalize the use of marijuana for medical purposes was California by 1996, and Illinois was the 20th state to allow its use. So Governor Quinn, on August 2nd, signed House Bill 1, which is a bill that will legalize marijuana for medical purposes in the state of Illinois. So the law goes into effect on January 1st. I think we'll talk a little bit about, I think there will be a delay before it's actually an available option for individuals. I think an important point for all of us in this community is that this is written as a sunset provision. It's a law that's written that it can expire. So if things don't go well, as physicians, we don't do well prescribing it, it turns into something of abuse or waste, they can simply let this die 4 years from now. They don't have to do anything. The state government can say, listen, good idea, didn't work. We don't have to amend the law. We don't have to do anything. 4 years from now, this goes away. So 4 years from now, the hope is that this will be effective for some people. It's not going to be for everybody. And that 4 years from now, they're going to amend the existing law or write a new law at that point in time. So as of right now, it is definitively not a now and forever law. It's good until 2018, and then it automatically expires unless renewed. Marijuana is illegal from a federal standpoint. There's a question as to how do we get around this. The federal government has opposed any sort of research with medical marijuana. It has opposed its use on a federal standpoint. That being said, it looks like the federal government, at least in some publications and in the states that have allowed it, really has not shown an extreme interest in prosecuting people over the medical-based use of marijuana. So it really appears that the federal government has said, as long as you have reasonably written state laws and people aren't violating the state law, we're essentially going to leave you alone. If you're paying attention to the news, the federal government has a few problems to worry about right now. And what we're doing in Illinois is probably not the highest on their list. So it really looks like the state of Illinois said, as far as we can tell, we don't have to enforce federal laws. That's not our obligation as a state. So we think that we're within our rights as a state to make this legal. And it looks like the federal government has basically said, as long as you're using it in a reasonable way, we're going to worry about other issues in the country, and we're not going to make this a big issue. So it's a little awkward as a physician. I'm licensed, my DEA is a federal DEA, so theoretically I'm going to write for a medication with a federal DEA that's not allowed under federal rules, and I'm going to write for it in the state of Illinois, but it looks like it's going to be fine from the physician standpoint. If you're a veteran and you get your health care through the VA, it's a little bit of a concern, right? Your physicians are federal employees. There's actually provisions written in the rules as to how people kind of get around that. It's very specifically addressed. So, well, what does the law actually say? I highlighted what I think is an important point here. State law should make a distinction between the medical and non-medical uses of cannabis. The purpose of the act is to protect patients with debilitating medical conditions, as well as their physicians and providers, from arrest or prosecution, criminal and other penalties, property forfeiture, if the patient engaged in the medical use of cannabis. I think it goes out of its way to point out it doesn't mean you can use it all the time wherever you want. It really very clearly has to be under medical guidelines. You can't be arrested, prosecuted, denied any sort of rights if you possess marijuana or use it, as long as you possess the proper amount that we'll get into. So this is actually, I think, a pretty well-written law. Other states have had bigger issues. The laws were kind of vague. Illinois tried to look at the other 19 states to make the rules much more restrictive. I think correctly so. So what's an adequate supply? Very specifically says you cannot have more than the adequate supply, which is defined as 2.5 ounces. So if you're driving around with 5 or 7.5 or 10 ounces, you are violating the state law. You can and potentially will be arrested at that point in time. So you are allowed to get 2.5 ounces every 14 days for your personal use. That is based on pre-mixed weight. I've been learning a lot about this over the last couple of days. That means essentially the actual plant itself, so the buds, the leaves, things of that nature. If the product is in turn turned into something else, you turn it into brownies, oil-based products, it still goes back to the pre-mixed weight. You're not responsible for weighing it. We're going to talk about where this is going to be accessible. So 2.5 ounces every 2 weeks is what someone with a qualifying medical condition is entitled to. Patients can apply for a waiver. So if a physician feels that 2.5 ounces is not adequate, the physician can write a letter saying, I think this person needs more based on the following reasons. So again, I highlighted at the bottom, you're allowed 2.5 ounces. You cannot have more than that. If you start stockpiling and for whatever reason you get arrested, you will be arrested for that. You're allowed 2.5 ounces. So I called one of my friends who may occasionally partake and has some knowledge of this. And I said, I mean, just ballpark, 2.5 ounces, I don't know, that doesn't sound like a lot to me. This is his actual reaction here at the bottom of this slide. There was a stunned silence. I actually called him at work. I didn't realize he was at work. I said, hey, I just got a couple questions for you. You know, ballpark for me, how much is 2.5 ounces and how much does that cost? And he goes, I'm in the middle of work and I'm going to call you back in a couple minutes. And he stepped outside. So the actual reaction was 2.5 ounces is apparently an enormous amount of marijuana. Again, I couldn't tell you, but the general consensus I got was that this is a fairly large supply. It doesn't mean you have to get 2.5 ounces, but you're entitled to up to, not entitled, but you can get access to up to 2.5 ounces. The price it can be somewhat expensive. Now again, you don't, as a patient, it's not like it's 0 or 2.5. The way most of these are set up, you can buy gradations of this. This is fairly expensive. So believe it or not, that's an actual website. I understand the wording is small. It's called priceofweed.com. You can find great stuff with a Google internet search. Again, one of the more entertaining searches I've done. It's a website where people actually submit how much they're paying on the street for product. And so I'm sure this is a very authoritative website. In Illinois, high-quality marijuana is about $362 per ounce. So obviously, times that by 2.5. That's what it'll potentially cost. If you look at other states, so I was able to find data from Washington, D.C., which is interesting, right? Because that's a federal district, but it's legal there, even though it's not legal federally. The cost about $380 to $440 per ounce, and there's also a tax on top of that. So they had a fairly high price. In New Jersey, similar kind of pricing that you're seeing, ranging from the sort of $300 to $400 per ounce, and then there's also a permit that you have to apply for. So Individuals aren't, again, not obligated to buy the full ounce, so you can buy smaller quantities potentially. Currently, insurance is not covering this. Most insurance companies have said, listen, this is illegal from a federal standpoint, and we are national-based companies, so we're worried about running afoul of the law, and there's also not as much data as we want. So currently, insurance is not covering it. Who is eligible? So you can be a card holder. I'm going to get into the card holding process here in a minute. A card holder is a qualifying patient or designated caregiver who's been issued and possesses a valid registry identification card by the Department of Health. Qualifying means you have a specific medical condition. I have the list coming up here in a minute. You're actually going to be issued, theoretically this isn't out yet, but you'll be actually issued a card that will look sort of like your driver's license. In theory, that's what's done in other states. That says that you have a qualifying medical condition you have the right to possess. That's something you're going to have to submit on an annual basis, so it's going to be a renewal just like most other licenses. You do have to be, as far as I can understand, registered in the state of Illinois. I assume that to mean you've got to be a citizen of Illinois. I don't know what you do if you live in Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, or Kentucky, and your physician is over the border. I can tell you that in some states, the transport across state lines is not legal. There are people in Nevada who were pulled over. They were coming from California. It's illegal in both states, but they were still fined because they transported it across state lines. So it looks like this is an Illinois-specific law only to cover people from the state of Illinois. So I think if you're from out of state, I don't think you qualify in Illinois. It's up to your own state. Locally, I think just Michigan allows. So who can qualify? Designated person. You have to be over the age of 8. Who else can pick up besides a patient? So some people can't get to the dispensaries. Anyone over the age of 18 who's a designated caregiver, as long as they don't have a disqualifying conviction. So if you have a criminal record, particularly violent crimes or crimes related to violations of federal drug law, you would have to in turn apply for a waiver if that applies to you. So it's not an absolute no, but you have to apply and show why you're potentially allowed to be a caregiver. A patient can designate a single caregiver. What they're trying to avoid is that there's one caregiver for like 25 patients, which would be potentially problematic if you didn't run afoul of the law. So if you have a caregiver, you can designate that person as your caregiver, and they can also pick up the product for you. What do you need from your physician? You're going to need written certification. So the physician is going to have to sign a date that, in the physician's opinion, you are going to benefit from the product, that you have some specific, roughly speaking, indication to get it, so you have a qualifying medical condition, and you also have symptoms of it. Certainly as a physician, one of the concerns I have is that a lot of young MS patients particularly are asymptomatic, and I've got a lot of young kids walking into the clinic going, sounds great. I'm like, well, there's nothing wrong though. Your exam is normal. You don't have spasticity or fatigue. I mean, what are we writing it for? So you should, theoretically, we should be treating something with the marijuana. So you need to have a qualifying condition. You actually have to have symptoms that we're going to be theoretically treating. And an important point is you have to have a bona fide relationship with the physician. And this is where it apparently has been a big problem in some other states, that there's been sort of doc in a box. You walk into the clinic and go, I've got X, and they go, sounds great. Here's your prescription. By the way, I'm selling it literally at the booth next to me. Illinois said you can't do that. You have to have an actual relationship. The state, you actually sign, the state can actually request your medical records. So if they think that a physician is setting up sort of a front where you're going to let all these people come in and you're just writing prescriptions to sell, they're going to go to that physician and say, we want to see the medical records. And if all of a sudden they can't produce it, presumably I would assume they're going to violate the law. So it's supposed to actually be a doctor actually caring for your medical condition. So I think that's an important distinction not seen in some other states. This is just a little more information about the registry cards. We already sort of mentioned this is a little bit of a duplicate. Written certification from the physician. Your medical records can potentially be requested by the state, which we did sort of touch on there. So the state, again, my assumption would be if they see a physician writing just huge quantities of this, they're going to likely go to that physician's office to request records, which they have the right to do. And you will actually be expected to submit a set of fingerprints to apply for the card. And what that's for is to screen the database to see if you're in violation of any other state or federal laws that would disqualify you as a patient or caregiver. What would we potentially expect this to look like? So A signed and dated medical marijuana registry form. These are not currently available to the best of my knowledge. I couldn't find anything. State of Illinois website. My expectation is that this will all come into effect after January 1st. Right, the law is not currently in effect. It goes into effect January 1 of 2014. So I have not seen any forms per se. I've had a few people come in the clinic saying, I need to help me fill out the form. And to the best of my knowledge, the form does not exist. It will probably not exist until after January 1st. And it will presumably be a photo ID. This is an example of a California photo ID. I think it's going to look like a driver's license, essentially. Except you shouldn't drive. We'll get into that. So these are qualifying medical conditions. So I sort of thought it was going to be for like 2 or 3 diagnoses. I thought it was going to be multiple sclerosis and pain related to HIV or cancer. This is a pretty long list. I believe there are 33 conditions on there. I did highlight that multiple sclerosis is on that list. But these would all be considered qualifying medical conditions. If somebody carries a diagnosis, that is step 1, and then potentially able to get access. And we're at the National MS Society meeting. The one that's the most obvious that I highlighted there is multiple sclerosis is on that list. So it's a qualifying medical condition to have this prescription written. You can, if somebody doesn't have MS, doesn't have a diagnosis on this list, they can petition the state for a waiver, and the state can go on a case-by-case basis to determine if it's indicated for that reason. These ones are automatic. In terms of where will people be able to get access, this is probably going to be one of the big holdups at the beginning. The state's going to designate 22 cultivation centers. So there are apparently 22 police districts in the state of Illinois. There will be 1 cultivation center per district. So here locally, I assume we're District 2, 15, 5, and District C. There'll be 1 cultivation center in each district. So a cultivation center is somewhere where they can actually grow product. And there's going to be likely for the individuals who do this some startup cost. Permits in other states range from $50,000 or more, and you've got to build the structure and everything. The cost estimates are $350,000 to $2 million for the startup cost for a cultivation center. Cultivation center cannot sell. Cultivation centers will in turn sell to dispensaries. There will be 60 in Illinois. These are not designated yet. Again, I wouldn't expect this. I wouldn't expect applications for permits until after January 1st. 60 dispensaries will be set up throughout the state. Dispensaries can exclusively sell to qualifying patients with a card with an indicated medical reason. You can get 2.5 ounces from the center. You have to designate a center, so you can't go basically driving around the state from center to center to center to center. Again, if you have more than 2.5 ounces on your possession, you are running afoul of the law in Illinois, for what I can tell. So 60 dispensaries. As a patient, you will need to designate your dispensary. That's the only dispensary you can go to unless you switch. Unlike other states, dispensaries will not be consuming centers. So there will not be coffee shops in Illinois. There are in other states and other countries. You actually will buy product there and then leave the premises. No physicians can be on site. No consuming actually on site. Probably the biggest holdup is going to be the cultivation centers. So again, with very accurate research, about 2 to 6 months to grow product. So even if there's a center up and running on January 1, all the product has to be grown in Illinois. Now, we already grow a lot of this product in Illinois, but it's got to be actually grown at a cultivation center. So the probably large amount that we are growing in the middle of our cornfields does not count. It would certainly be pretty brave of someone, if they're already growing product, to then apply to be a cultivation center saying, we already got the groundwork in. I assume they're not going to do that. So that's realistically what's going to push this into the summer or into the fall as well. So there's also some additional rules on where you can use it. So we're not going to be sitting outside smoking. Doesn't allow someone to engage in, does not prevent the imposition of any civil, criminal, or other penalties for engaging in the following conduct. Undertaking tasks we're doing so would be negligent. So if you're driving under the influence, right, it's legal to consume alcohol in the state of Illinois. Banned prohibition a long time ago. One of the greatest constitutional amendments of all time. You cannot drive a vehicle under the influence of alcohol. That's illegal. Driving a vehicle while impaired from a medication, including this one, is illegal. So you cannot smoke marijuana, become impaired, and drive your car and assume that you're going to have some legal protection. You will presumably not. You are still at fault. A couple ones that seem sort of obvious, but they still have to be written into the law. You can't possess or smoke on a school bus. Anyone was wondering about that, it seems pretty reasonable to me that was put in there. Cannot use on school grounds, can't use in correctional facilities. You can't have it in a vehicle unless properly secured. So they want it to be, so obviously you're going to have to transport this product, right? You got to go from the dispensary home. And so it's got to be inaccessible in the car. So it's not like a cigarette. You cannot smoke driving your car and go, I've got a marijuana card. Great. You're still smoking driving your car. That's illegal. You can't smoke in public places. Now, that's true in Illinois of cigarette smoke. Illinois is a smoke-free state, so you can't smoke in a bar, right, which is a great rule. So really can't smoke in public places, can't smoke in proximity to children. Potential loophole is, well, what do you do if your neighbor has a young kid? Does that looks like privacy of your own residence is completely reasonable. Just also speaking of children, it can't be held against somebody in a custody battle. It's very specifically in the rules. So if somebody's getting divorced, the divorce lawyers, I'm sure, will try. They can't turn around and say, well, this person has access to medical marijuana, therefore they can't have kids in their house. Very specifically in the rules that that's not allowed to do that from a legal standpoint. So I'm sure someone will try to do it. I sort of wrapped a couple rules into this one. You essentially can't share or sell. The selling part sort of makes sense. You're not allowed to sell your medical marijuana to someone else. That makes you a drug dealer, and that's illegal in Illinois, and then you are in big trouble. You can go to real jail for that for a real long time, and you can't use marijuana in jail. So don't sell your product. That's not legal. And you really aren't supposed to share it. The caregiver is just supposed to pick it up and provide it, not also partake. Again, you're in a private residence. What you do in the privacy of your own home is whatever. Law enforcement, firefighters, people with commercial driver's license or truck drivers are not supposed to get access. So, a couple other big points. Nothing in the act shall be construed to create a defense for a third party who fails a drug test. So this sort of comes in these 2 points here. If you work for a company that has a zero tolerance policy and says you cannot use drugs and we will randomly drug screen, this does not exempt you from your workplace rules. I don't think that the very reasonable disability laws that you need to get access, I don't think those are going to apply here. If your employer, like say you work for an airline, and the airline says you can't fly a plane if you've been smoking marijuana, as a passenger, I think that's a great idea. It doesn't exempt you from those rules. So if you have workplace rules, those still count. So if you're required to do drug testing, better talk to your employer before you go forward. Nothing can prevent private business, universities, colleges from prohibiting the use. So it's up to the person who owns the property to say you can't smoke. Again, it really, or use it in any other way. Really looks like it's going to probably be in the privacy of somebody's home. So one place is probably pretty reasonable for access. And as I already mentioned, that's legal in Illinois. Doesn't mean you can travel with it. If you're flying to Disney World, you're getting on an airplane with marijuana, you can't do that. You're going to get in a lot of trouble if you get stopped by the TSA agent. They will probably not care that you have an Illinois marijuana card when you land in Orlando. So don't travel with it. Like Michael Vick a couple years ago. So how does medication work? So that's a lot about the law. Over the next couple minutes, sort of what's the data? There's actually a bunch of different cannabinoids that are available. Your body produces cannabinoids. Cannabinoids just implies the fact that they attach to a certain receptor. So cannabinoids are derived from your cell. They can be derived from plants, and they also can be synthetically created. So these are essentially molecules that attach to receptors, and those receptors in turn have a variety of functions. So you're activating a receptor in the brain by consuming this. There are currently 4 available products. Not all of them are approved in the United States of America. Marinol, which is the one that's been more commonly used, and Pisamet. Marinol specifically is approved in the U.S. We've used it for nausea and appetite stimulation in individuals with particularly cancer or HIV. These are oral medications. Advantage is you know exactly how much you're getting with every single dose. It's really been used primarily for nausea. It's been used a little bit for spasticity without great data. Sativex is interesting. It's an oral spray. This is approved in England and Canada and 9 other European countries. It's a spray that actually has clinical trial data for the use in spasticity. It'd actually be surprising if this wasn't ultimately approved in the U.S. The English and the Canadians have a higher threshold than we do for approving medications, and has shown data that it reduces spasticity and pain as an oral spray. No hallucinogenic qualities. And an investigational drug called Rimabant that may reduce cravings, which is still very, very early with that medication. So these are oral medications that are actually available in the U.S. or internationally. For the U.S., for states that grow marijuana, the marijuana generally is going to be a blend of two components. There's two components, THC and cannabidiol, that are the major sort of component of marijuana that causes effect. THC is what can cause psychoactive components. It's highly expressed to receptors in the hippocampus and neocortex, things involved with things like memory, impulse control, sensation. It's found in other areas as well, particularly including nerves, and this may be why it has an analgesic effect. In the recreational market, the goal is to produce a product with a very high THC content because it causes a pretty significant high to it. It looks like, medically speaking, the cannabidiol is the more important component. It has less psychoactive features, but probably has more to do with pain control and spasticity. So it'll take some time to try to grow product in Illinois that works well for certain people, but it looks like every specific center is going to have to try to grow a combination drug. And you can do this through genetic planning with the product that has a combination of THC and cannabidiol. So when you're buying medical marijuana, the reality is you're probably going to have different options at your disposal, and everyone's going to respond differently. You don't know a lot about dosing or titration with the medications. In terms of actual clinical data that's out there, it is mixed. A lot of this is hampered by the fact that in the United States of America, as a medical community, we're restricted. The federal government won't fund a lot of the research. Again, this is an illegal product federally. So that there's limited data right now in terms of randomized controlled trials. So some trials have not shown a significant benefit in terms of pain and spasticity. This was a European-based trial. Other trials have shown reduced pain, reduced problems with sleep, and reduced problems with spasticity. Anecdotally, I would say I've talked to some patients who feel that it's really helpful, particularly at nighttime, for their spasticity. If you're looking for hardcore randomized controlled trials, as we talked about this morning, the data is just not there, and we're probably not going to have data because we can't get the funding for those kind of studies here in the United States. How is the product going to be used? It actually looks like smoking the product is the most effective way for symptomatic management. It looks like from the available data, there's more control over the smoked product, and it actually looks like vaporizers, and this is an example. You can actually go online and find tons of different vaporizers. They run from very inexpensive to very expensive, up to about $200. The advantage of the vaporizers is there's a little more control over how much you take. It reduces some of the toxins from the actual burning of both the paper and the leaf. So talking to people who have some experience with this, they recommend vaporizers. It looks like the eaten product, so things like brownies, there's more variability in terms of how much is accessible. So you don't necessarily get the same consistent response. So the general consensus of the available stuff you can find in medical literature says the vaporizers look like maybe the sort of most efficient option. Oil-based products, not as clear exactly how this is going to be used. This is sort of a new thing. You can have oil-based marijuana. I assume it's smoked, but I'm not exactly sure about that. I did talk to a friend of mine, and he didn't know, and if he didn't know, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to find it in the medical literature, because he seemed to know a lot of this. So side effects. Well, so the side effects are people can have dysphoria, anxiety, and potentially paranoia. These are fairly common side effects of marijuana. As I mentioned earlier, it's the amount of THC in the product that seems to be the issue. So there's going to have to be some control over how much THC is actually what's sold. Not surprisingly, it can cause some problems with memory. It can cause slow reaction time. None of this is really surprising to most people. It can certainly increase hunger. It is a smoked product, so there can be the potential for some lung issues. Individuals who have never been exposed to it before, who have never used the product recreationally, they may expect these side effects to occur and seem to have a little harder time the first time they're exposed to it in life. One question is, can the recreational use of marijuana cause cognitive impairment? The most obvious answer is yes. After all, that's the basic reason for recreational use. So certainly it can alter the way that you think, which is why you shouldn't smoke and then drive around in a car. If you want to know what that's going to look like, if you've never seen Cheech and Chong's Up in Smoke, it gives you an idea of what happens if you have a van that's covered in marijuana-based paint that you light on fire and you drive around the city. There's also the potential, there's some debate in the literature as to whether or not marijuana can cause psychosis or even potentially schizophrenia. There's a lot of disagreement about the available data. There's some question if people already have a pre-existing psychiatric disorder, if it simply unmasks it. if they're self-medicating with marijuana or it actually potentially can cause it. This concern about some of the psychoactive features of schizophrenia led to a movie in the 1930s called Reefer Madness. I've never seen this movie. You can get pieces of it on YouTube. I did have a patient who told me the only way to watch this was if you smoked marijuana before you watched it. It made the movie much more acceptable. I'm just going to take him at his word for it. It is available on YouTube. It's used to scare children. There are some serious side effects, though, particularly in young women. There's a headache syndrome that can also be associated with stroke called reversible vasoconstriction syndrome. It's fairly rare, but this is a pretty significant side effect if it occurs. And if it occurs, they really recommend that individuals avoid certain precipitants, marijuana being one of them. So it's going to probably be part of our screening tests. As a physician, one reason why I think it's reasonable that we have access to this from a legal standpoint is buying recreational drugs is illegal in the United States of America, and you're never quite sure what the product is that you are going to be getting. So this is a real case. This was published in New England Journal of Medicine a couple of years ago. There were a number of really kids in Germany who were diagnosed with lead encephalopathy. They were actually very worried in Germany that it was a terrorist attack on the water supply. They had a whole bunch of cases all come in at once. And they were very worried someone had laced the water supply with lead, and they were about to have a major problem on their hands. And after a while, they said, it's weird that like no one else is, everyone's like 18 to 30 something. There's like no older people, no younger people, and everyone's drinking the same water supply. So they finally pinned a couple of these kids down, and they all started pulling out marijuana bags, and they tested it, and the dealers had weighed the marijuana bags down with lead to make the baggie heavier. So when you see, it's 2.5 ounces, well, about an ounce of it was lead. Smoking lead is distinctly bad for you. But so this is one of the problems, right? You're not exactly sure what the product is that you're getting. The hope is that in controlling the product through the state that you're getting actual quality product, and there's not additional contaminants that are available. Who shouldn't take the medication? Potentially people with severe heart disease. If you have a history of very bad hypertension, bad heart disease, this is probably not a good option for you. People with psychiatric disorders, particularly schizophrenia or psychosis. Women who are pregnant or breastfeeding. It is not legal for children under the age of 18. It may actually cause long-term problems if children consume. People intending to start families and individuals with an allergy to marijuana. It can interact with other medications. You can use concomitant tobacco use. You can increase your heart rate. If you're taking medications like benzodiazepines, other opiates, tricyclic antidepressants, it may decrease your level of alertness a little bit further. Sleeping pills and marijuana could be problematic. Significant alcohol use, blood pressure medications, kind of blood thinner. People with asthma shouldn't smoke. This was actually surprisingly contradictory. They used to give people who had asthma marijuana. That seems sort of counterintuitive to me, but it would potentially be a concern. One major issue for folks with MS is that it can potentially worsen depression, and we already have you on some medications that can cause depression, so that's going to be an issue to at least discuss. I think the sort of bottom line with the data we have is that there's not a lot of randomized controlled trials. There's certainly some anecdotal experience here in Illinois and then throughout the country that for some people this is potentially going to be an option to treat some symptoms, particularly spasticity and pain. It looks like it is probably reasonably safe, used in a reasonable way for most people. We don't have long-term data. I think we do have to recognize, though, there's certainly the social component that this sounds like a lot of fun, and it's certainly fun to talk about. This is still a controlled substance. It's a real drug. It can cause real problems. If it's not used appropriately, it's going to lead to big problems, just like a lot of other medications that we have. So I think it's going to be a nice option if used correctly by the physicians and by patients. It's going to be a major problem if it's used incorrectly. So I think that this, the final piece of information I think is true. The quote there by a guy named Sidney Allison, who came up with one of the original MS criteria. It was true of a lot of MS research. It's true of certainly complementary and alternative therapies. That we have reasonable ideas, right? So you come up with an idea and say, this is probably going to work. But what we really need is that sort of long, methodical collection of data to say, this is really a good option for us. That's what we talked about earlier this morning. So we can really say that, this is a good option. This is how you use it. This is the data behind it. So with that, we've got a couple minutes, because then Dr. Antati is going to come in. I'll try to answer a couple questions. And Dr. Antati graciously agreed to switch with me, because I have tickets to Notre Dame USC.
Oh.
Yep.
Hi, thank you. Hi, You know what? I came to this because I wanted to listen. I wanted to just listen to you, doctor. And I thought that I was coming to listen to alternatives. Okay? Alternatives. And for me, this is not an alternative.
Yeah.
This is not an alternative. What this is numbing you, which I understand why they're introducing medical marijuana. Okay? Because of spasticity, because of pain, whatever that us as MS sufferers are going through. Have you heard anything about the pilot study that's been going on in the UK with power plate and MS patients?
I have not.
No? Okay, well, there's a pilot that's going on over there, and the result, it is a question. Okay, my question is, are there any other alternatives that you are aware of that help MS patients?
Sure. So, and I think this morning, the keynote speaker really spoke very eloquently to the primary research being done for neural repair. We have a number of emerging therapies that are out there. So, to me, and again, I'm going to point out that the bottom of this slide and the first slide I think are critical. First of all, I think that this topic is an important one. This is going to be something new and available in the state of Illinois. When you look at complementary and alternative, to me that is defined as medications for which are new therapies to MS, and this is certainly one of them. This is going to be something that's going to affect every one of my patients. This is now officially an option for them. So for my own personal reasons, I think this is a really critical topic to review. And when you get into complementary and alternative therapies, you could go in a lot of different directions with it. For me, what the first and last quote are, I think, are really critical, that we do have a lot of data, but it takes a lot of time. Some of the MS trials, those trials take 10 to 20 years. The research that was presented today, that is hardcore scientific research. That took 20 years or so to come along. This is very, very complicated stuff, and we need that kind of research. And I think for really effective treatments, it takes decades. I don't know if I answered the question as much as made a statement.
I know this is a question time, but I just wanted to quickly state I have the MS hug. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but it's a spasm in my entire rib cage, abdomen. I have it 24/7, 365. I'm on tons of antispasm medications. The only thing that has helped me has been marijuana. So I just want to say, don't discount it. I think what he is talking about is very important, and we need to know the legalities of an option like that. Now, I will ask also, I've been experimenting with some other alternative therapies, acupuncture and abdominal massages. Those are very come and go. Is there anything that you're aware of that is an alternative therapy that is more lasting? Because everything right now I'm doing is just to kind of get by.
Sure, and I think you get a question, what is an alternative therapy? For symptoms like the Lermite sign or the MS hug, the best things are probably data we have. It seems like temperature control. They're trying to stay from getting overheated, using things like the cooling vest. Medications don't seem to help all that much for it, despite a number of different efforts. Acupuncture, massage for some people is effective. Is there a lot of data? No, there's not currently. So, probably the best I can do. Sure. Yep. So LDN was certainly came on the interest about 5 years ago. Again, with LDN, there's just not a lot of data out there. The data we have is very, very small. So can I show you a lot of data on it? No. So I think it's going to come to fruition. Maybe, maybe not. We just don't have a lot of data on it. So there's been a few small studies out west. That's about what we got. Yep. So I think, and Dr. Wynn spoke to it. Vitamin D appears to be extremely effective for MS. Probably around 2,000 to 4,000 units a day seems like reasonable. Checking a vitamin D level with your physician is going to be helpful. If you talk to most neurologists who don't have MS also will now take vitamin D. So particularly as we head into the winter months, this is probably a reason we have a high relapse rate in the spring, is that our vitamin D levels drop. So it looks like to me it's a no-brainer, low risk, great option.
Doctor, who is going to monitor the supply? Certainly not the FDA.
Correct. So it's going to be monitored by the state, and this is actually, it's self-funded, so there's a tax on the product. So it's going to fund itself. I think there's a 6% tax on the actual sale of the actual product, and there's also tax on the dispensary and the cultivation center. So it's going to self-fund, and then it's a combination of the Department of Agriculture is going to oversee cultivation centers, and the Department of, I believe, Health will oversee the dispensaries.
Hi there. Just a quick question about nutritional therapy. What's your perspective as a medical physician as to why we haven't gotten any farther from many, many years ago when Dr. Swank did a study, and obviously he did not outlive his study. And it just seems to those of us with the disease that maybe Big Pharma has a big hand in the monetary backing of some of the studies for drugs. So what's your thoughts on how can we help with fundraising to get some real controlled studies done on, let's say, anti-inflammatory diets?
Right, so you mentioned probably the real challenge there is organizing a study of that nature. In fact, there actually was a study recently done in Europe, primarily out of Spain, looking at diet on cardiovascular risk factors. Long study, it's not an MS, but it's a long study, and it's one of the first really high-quality dietary studies. The challenge becomes how do you have a randomized controlled trial? Most of the MS studies, most studies, period, it's placebo versus drug, or now we're starting to see studies that are drug versus known therapy, so standard of care. The problem with dietary data, we don't have that. So it's very hard to organize those studies. There's a lot of different variables. There's a bunch of different diets that are advocated. Swank diet is one example. Paleo diet has been advocated. I think realistically it's going to be hard to get the big studies that we need. We're going to see smaller collections of data.
Hi, Doctor. I wanted to know, when will you doctors know what's going on? Because right now my doctor doesn't really know the timetable. Is there a timetable that you guys are going to actually have to say, all right, now we're educated, we can tell you, the patient?
Yep, so I think it depends on what the final thing is we're trying to know. When you look at, again, today's lecture this morning, just the complexity of the human nervous system is unbelievable. It is much easier to shoot a man to the moon and land him there and bring him back than it is to understand the really basic building blocks of the human brain and nervous system. So I wouldn't give it a time window. I don't know. I think that's the best answer. We're much farther along than we were 10, 20, 100, 200 years ago. Does that mean we're 10 or 20 years away from final answers to everything? No. I think it'll be an ongoing process forever.
Are there any other questions? All right. Well, perfect. Thank you, Dr. McCoy, for a great presentation.